I remember the first time I traced my finger along the railroad embankment on a faded aerial print. The way the pencil marks of some long-ago staff officer wrapped around it like rosary beads. July 12, 1943 sits there in the record with cool confidence grid references, timings, unit symbols. But when I walk the ground, the paper comes alive with heat. The steppe east of Prokhorovka rises and falls in stubborn, shallow breaths. The cell glints with no intention to help anyone. The wheat whispers over mine belts sown by tired hands in the dark. Even before the first shot, the field decided what kind of stories men would be allowed to tell about it. Later, veterans would talk about hand-to-hand fighting of tanks, the myth of steel gripping steel. The files on my desk after action reports, war diaries, Rotmistrov's memoirs, German Corps reports. The later compilations from both archives whisper otherwise, and yet they do not entirely contradict the memory of closeness. My task is to thread those whispers to the shouts. Citadel had ground forward like a great machine running slightly off its bearings. From the south, the Sekunasu SS Panzer Corps pressed toward Prokhorovka. Panthers and heavy cats mingled with reliable Panzer V's, their gunners drilled to quick arithmetic. From the Soviet side came Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, thrown in with ferocity and speed tank corps hustled into line across ground already chewed by days of fighting. When I turn the pages of the operational orders, I can hear urgency between the lines. Strike, the verbs say, crowd and break. The counterpoint in German documents is calm or fix. Etrit, hold the line of observation. Between those grammars lay the embankment, the low wall of packed earth that conferred sight and shelter, and more than either commander, determined the day's manners. There is a certain ceremony at dawn that every armored crew performs, and the sources are unanimous about it. A loader taps knuckles against casing rims, counting by sound and habit. A driver presses the clutch and listens for promises or lies. A gunner wipes a lens with a rag that used to be a shirt. A commander scans for flags. Because radio nets will soon degrade into music, Soviet sappers, whose names the record so rarely keeps, move in advance with mine prods, cutting narrow lanes through belts their comrades had laid. I have in front of me a Soviet engineer's report, cramped Cyrillic letters noting a width in meters, a number of devices lifted, a casualty endured without ceremony. Those lanes, pencil thin on a map, would become arteries through which whole brigades were asked to flow. When someone later insists it was all a chaotic melee, I flip back to those engineer lines. Chaos must go single file when the earth still bites. The first artillery schedules turn the sky into a metronome. Smoke is written into the valleys. The embankment's eastern face becomes a ledger of hits and near misses. German accounts emphasize the patience of their anti-tank screens, a pack front position to enforce angles. Guns massed until silhouettes offer themselves. Soviet accounts emphasize impulse, the need to seize initiative after days of receiving. Both are telling the truth of their tasks. I stand in that truth when I walk the Balka edges. They are shallow, treacherous folds that swallow tracks and give back nothing but dust. The map symbols for ditch and gully look modest. In the field, they are decisions the ground makes for you. So, was it hand-to-hand I hold two kinds of testimony? In Rotmistrov's recollection, crews closed to near-suicidal ranges, ramming and firing point blank, a storm of iron at conversational distance. In the German regimental diaries, the language is colder ranges in hundreds of meters, stationary hull-down fire, flank shots taken as Soviet columns spilled from lanes toward the embankment. When I interview men who were there decades later, their hands become compasses. They draw lines in the air to show where smoke bunched and where sight lines narrowed. We could shout to them, one says, meaning both sides to the same horizon of terror. The truth hides in the shape of the ground and in the timing at certain funnels near the embankment. The lanes forced machines into near neighborhood. Elsewhere, it was the measured duel of gunnery, the arithmetic that good crews learn until it becomes reflex. By mid-morning, the sun pours iron into everything. The after-action reports downgrade their adjectives as the day heats stout resistance. Heavy fire, confused situation. I can picture it without adding dramatic paint. A Soviet tank noses up the embankment to peek and gives its belly to a gun that has been patient for 2 hours. Another tank slips into a gully, vanishes from a commander's quick pencil sketch of where everyone should be. A German battery shifts its aim from slaughter to suppression to break a formation and let dust and fear do their part. Aircraft arrive like verdicts, Stukas, and Hs-129s bite at columns caught in the open. Soviet fighters carve into the dive angles. And for fugitive seconds, the sky feels as crowded as the soil. Pilots write of dust reaching up. Gunners write of sky falling in shards. I let both sentences exist without insisting one drown the other. The fiercest lines I have read do not speak of heroics first. They speak of labor. A loader's forearms take on the sheen of heated propellant. A driver sits on his fear as if it were a restless dog and backs into smoke because the commander promised smoke would treat him better than light. A gunner, jolted, corrects with a movement so small it does not have a noun. A signalman, blown from his stool, resets his net and brings an entire flank back into conversation. The tigerish axe the ram, the last round duel within a stone's throw, appear as bright shards in this fabric. And yes, they happened. And their witnesses are not lying. But they are not the cloth. I walk the line where the embankment breaks for a culvert and imagine what a column saw a gap that looks like an invitation. A map that insists it is a road. A sudden horizontal of daylight where a gun has already squared its will. Rex would later mark these spots like punctuation. Crews learned to read Rex the way scholars read marginalia. A turret sheared at the ring means a clean hit at impolite range. A burned hull near the mouth of a lane tells of a traffic jam turned abattoir. I have photographs taken the next day from the air gray, ghosts of outlines, smoke stains, the neat geometry of arcs where gunners had held to discipline. The legend of wrestling does not photograph well. Discipline does. By noon, both sides feel the bad mathematics of momentum. The Soviet commander must choose how much of his last clean tank company to spend. He holds it longer than his blood would like. In the Neuaktuellen SS Panzer Corps diary, staff officers note barrel wear and ammunition stocks with more attention than adjectives. Restraint, on both sides, begins to look like genius. This is the hour when the myth of hand-to-hand gets its strongest fuel. The lanes have compacted the fight near the embankment. Crews who cannot see far swear the world has shrunk to the length of a turret. Men whose nerves have been sawed flat by noise mistake nearness of terror for nearness of metal. I do not correct them. I translate them. Their closeness is true in the currency that matters to survival. I have a Soviet Tank Corps report that lists advances in hundreds of meters and losses in columns that do not carry adjectives. Fire from the embankment intensified. Air intervention significant. Bridges unavailable. Fords unreliable. In the German notations, I find a mirror Soviet armored counterattack frequent. Ranges variable. Mines effective. Anti-tank positions maintained. Between the lines in both languages, I read the same understanding the ground asks payment in system, not in glamour. Anti-tank belts hold if fed ammunition in calm. Assaults succeed if their sappers keep cutting arteries faster than fear clots them. By the time the afternoon begins to lean, I can already sense the shape of the verdict forming in the margins. The day will not belong to a single charge or a single ram. It will belong to the unshowy disciplines the ranging shot walked on to a silhouette by a crew that has practiced together. The smoke canisters popped at the right second, the engineer section that keeps the artery open when everything around them says fold. The column halted for 5 minutes because a traffic post chose prudence instead of panic. None of this sounds romantic until one remembers what the alternative costs. And still, the image persists in books and documentaries of tanks locked like wrestlers in the dust by Prokhorovka. I understand why. The human mind prefers intimacy. It can picture over systems it cannot caress. The hand wants a hand to grasp, not a doctrine to study. I am not at war with that desire. I only refuse to let it rule the archive. When I lay the testimonies side by side, Soviet and German, proud and bitter, immediate and late, I can draw a map of where proximity erupted and where the day reverted to gunnery's cold craft. The embankment itself, that quiet general, denies absolutes. It manufactured pockets where shouting distance felt like the universe, and, within earshot, fields where meters mattered and mills decided. Evening will come, and with it the careful hands of recovery and burial and revision. Before we go there, before the smoke thins and the crews count what is left, I hold you at the noon edge and ask you to look not at a legend, but at a field that forced men to choose between audacity and patience every minute. Some chose well, some did not, and history is honest enough to keep both. The question of hand-to-hand is a question of scale, and scale is the first casualty of fear. My work is to restore it without stealing anyone's courage. By early afternoon, the heat had stripped the adjectives from every report. I read the hour in terse lines, fire heavy, movement delayed, embankment held, and I can feel the field disciplining rhetoric into numbers. South of the rail bridge, Soviet tank brigades funneled through sapper lanes like water through broken clay pipes, and the margins of those lanes became killing edges. I picture the first tanks cresting toward the embankment, snouts up, bellies exposed, because that is what the ground demanded if one wanted eyes. German guns waited under the lip, muzzles cut into the weeds, and when the silhouettes heaved into geometry, the firing tables came alive. In my notes, I have a column of ranges, 300, 200, 70, the way a heartbeat races and then staggers. Hand to hand, in memory, often begins here, where distance collapses to the length of a thought, but the record insists the bulk of kills were earned in that cruel middle space where optics still ruled and nerves were asked to be steady while bodies begged to bolt. I keep returning to the loaders. A veteran once flexed his forearms in front of me and said nothing. The shine on the skin was the only footnote he needed. In the Soviet brigades, a good loader bought seconds, and seconds bought ground. He fed the chamber like a man striking matches in the wind, routine flaring brighter because terror kept trying to blow it out. Across the embankment, in a Panzer IV, another loader mirrored the motion with different brass and the same prayerlessness. War, looked at from the angle of their elbows, is not ideology, but physics weight lifted to purpose until the muscles surrender. When I asked them about nearness, did you see faces? Could you have spoken to the men you killed? They shrug in a way learned inside steel. The world was a rectangle of glass and an order breathed across intercom hiss. Nearness was seconds, not meters. Air power arrived in brief, decisive commas. From the south came Hs 129s and Stukas, sniffing for columns caught between belts. From the east, Soviet fighters and Il-2s dragged skeins of tracers across the low sky. Pilots wrote later that dust rose to meet them. Tankers wrote that the sky fell in iron flakes. The truth sits between air did not decide the day, but it hurried decisions ground had already arranged. Smoke saved lives as surely as bombs took them. I have a German battery log noting visibility reduced by Sturmovik smoke, a tiny admission that sometimes survival comes in gray sheets, not in heroics. The myth of wrestling does not know what to do with smoke. The archive is fluent in it. Near the railway halt, a culvert drew attackers like a magnet and punished them with the predictability of a machine. Wrecks accumulated and began to speak a language of admonition. Crews on both sides learned to read. A turret pried open at the ring indicated a hit taken too high on the crest. A hull blackened by an internal fire told a story of ammunition stowed without the indulgence of time. I have aerial photographs from the next day, faint fan patterns on fields where guns had held and fired with measured patience. Dark smudges where a company had tried to force a seam and found a thesis instead. Photographs do not care about legend. They reconcile memory to geometry with a patient cruelty archives specialize in. By 2 o'clock, the lexicon of command shifted audibly in the documents. Rotmistrov's staff began to write of stabilizing and holding pivots, even while urging brigades to press across the rail line. On the opposite side, 7 SS Panzer Corps tallied barrel wear and ammunition expenditure with a clerk's unforgiving pen. Both sides had reached the hour when momentum grows more expensive than it looks. It is here that I locate what historians like to call the culmination point, and here that the legend of hand-to-hand finds its fertile soil. Lanes narrowed, dust blinded, Drivers edged forward on trust and inertia. Gunners waited one heartbeat too long because the sight danced. A ram occurred not as planned, but as collision of errors. Those moments burn bright in memory, and properly so, but by mass and by measure, the day remained a quarrel of arcs, not a clinch of holes. Signals failed and were reborn by ritual. Runners who believed themselves obsolete at dawn were priceless by afternoon. Their routes stitched through ditches and between smoking haystacks. Flag panels on command tanks spoke in sentences visible across 3 fields and nonsense across 4 when smoke intervened. A radio net collapsed under static and was hoisted back into usefulness by a sergeant with a fistful of fuses and the calm of a priest. In a German log, I find the line orders executed despite interference. In a Soviet report, guidance constant, though communication intermittent. These are dry ways of saying that men remembered how to be a system when wires pretended to be snakes. I stop over the cell because it mattered, even when it did not glitter in headlines. Engineer diaries show pontoons staged and then held, currents judged by eye and by superstition, sappers counting their own breath while laying anchors under intermittent shelling. Crossing in strength here would have changed not the myth, but the map. What occurred were gestures, a ferry of necessity, a plank bridge bullied into partial being, raids that returned with news and scars. The river in July is deceptive, polite to the gaze, hungry to the foot. Those who wrestle with myths seldom write about ropes and knots. Those who wrestle with rivers measure victory in how many vehicles arrived on the far bank with their engines still believing in work. Casualty returns begin to collect like stormwater. They acquire that bureaucratic numbness, which allows a staff to keep functioning while men stop. Numbers at this hour are anesthetic as well as truth. Yet here and there, the reports bleed out of their boxes. A company notes 3 tanks saved by a single smoke mission. An aid post logs a surge that aligns perfectly with a 5-minute shelling seen in another battalion's diary. A chaplain requests more stretchers and fewer questions. In the interviews decades later, veterans speak of smells as much as sights, the varnished tang of heated paint, the sour of cordite on the tongue, the sweetness of wheat burned into an unearned perfume. This is what fierce means when history tries to be honest, a total occupation of the senses that makes memory prefer symbols because symbols are easier to store. What of the famed charge? There was a knot of armor that pressed so near the embankment's lip that both sides later swore it could not have been legal under any god's law. I have mapped its probable path, and the map argues against legend even as it explains it. A shallow tongue of ground allowed approach. A fold hit a line of guns until the last second. A company commander chose audacity because every other verb had failed. Ramming occurred. Grenades leaped from hand to hatch. Voices carried, but like a spark blown backward into fuel. The brightness of that knot does not illuminate the whole field. More often, even there, guns settled disputes at plain ranges under ugly light, and the men who survived did so because their routines were stubborn and their commanders stingy with last reserves. As the sun tilted, restraint became courage's truest mask. Rotmistrov resisted the temptation to pour everything into a furnace that would have accepted the gift and returned ash. Hauser, for his part, husbanded his remaining striking power as if night were a bank that paid interest on discipline. Artillery shifted from the vivid grammar of preparation to the grudging prose of interdiction. Smoke grew thrifty. A German note reads, "Maintain observation posts, avoid pursuit without infantry." A Soviet one, anchor on rail line. Prepare for counter-thrust if enemy weakens. Otherwise conserve. This is not the language that fuels rumor. It is the language that prevents armies from waking up ruined. I have been asked why the myth persists when the paperwork resists it. The answer is not scorn, it is sympathy. Men remembered nearness because nearness is how shock records itself. A tank erupting 40 meters away abolishes the universe with more authority than a gun team firing accurately from 500. A ram is memory's favorite photograph. The historian's chore is not to sneer at this preference, but to frame it inside the larger negative, where most of the day was exposed arcs, ranges, lanes, the slow violence of attrition written by professionals whose faces do not appear in newsreels. If Prokhorovka taught anything worth teaching, it was that systems, not spasms, write verdicts on days of this size. Evening sidled in without ceremony, and with it a new set of verbs: recover, relocate, report, repair. Crews counted the shells left like a family counts candles during a power cut. Mechanics slid under hot hulls with the intimacy of surgeons. Medics moved along chalk lanes that had been sapper lanes at dawn, their economy a grim echo. Across the embankment, identical gestures unfolded in a different language. The day neither surrendered to myth nor entirely evaded it. It simply ended with both in its pockets. Night did not fall so much as gather, a careful collective of shadows pooling in the ruts and under the lip of the embankment. The last shells wandered off into the distance like late guests reluctant to accept closing time. I read the hour in other signs recovery vehicles edging forward with their lights hooded, engineers speaking in knots and numbers, medics testing the edges of their own steadiness. The documents turn almost domestic at dusk: lists of spares, counts of splints, timings for reliefs, and in that quiet bureaucracy, the true violence of the day declares itself. A battle that spends this much material and nerve must borrow the night to pay interest. I follow the mechanics because their grammar is the most honest. They approach a wreck the way a surgeon approaches a body that still owes something to the morning. A seized traverse becomes a case history. A cooked clutch is a diagnosis. A cannibalized pump, a small inheritance. Welding torches write pale signatures beneath tarps. And from 50 meters away, you can smell the acrid optimism of flux. I have a maintenance company ledger that reads like liturgy: recovered 3, returned to service 1, stripped 2, awaiting tow 4. The numbers are not dramatic, but the ledger is a bridge to dawn. Without it, legend has the field to itself. Medics and chaplains function as a pair of hands cupped around breath. In aid posts marked in chalk, morphine and murmurs do the day's unwritten work. Triages align with the rhythm of bombardments that ended hours ago. Nerves have their own artillery. I have an aid station report noting a patterned spikes of arrivals precisely 5 minutes after a shelling on the far slope. As if the earth required that much time to release men from its immediate claim. The stretcher bearers retrace the sapper lanes by instinct. Their economy is the mirror of morning's preparation. On both sides of the embankment, identical corridors of mercy run parallel in different languages. Scouts inherit the field when noise thins. They step off in twos, sometimes alone. Ears tuned to a spectrum of truths, the clack of a tool where no maintenance should be, the rustle of a wire being pulled across a gap, the unnatural silence of men holding their breath at their posts. The German logs call these Aufklärungsstreifen, the Soviet diaries Razvedka. I walk out with them in my reading and find the night argumentative but legible. A shutter bangs, and a map correction gets penciled. A barn's embered shell falls inward, and a likely line of sight opens where no one expected it. These are the tiny verdicts that shape the large one. Flares stitch pale canopies overhead. Star shells turn wheat into a temporary moonfield. Somewhere a machine gun panics for 3 seconds and is counseled back to discipline by a corporal who knows that noise attracts arithmetic. Tanks move in short, deliberate parcels, seeking defilade even from imagination. This is when the rumor of close quarters steel on steel could most plausibly have been born darkness, breeds distance's amnesia. Yet the armored war at night remains more choreography than brawl. Engines idle at reverent idle. Drivers feel their way along the embankment's shadow with palms on steel. Commanders trade ground for cohesion, one deliberate hull length at a time. The river asserts itself again. Pontoons creep toward assembly points like cautious thoughts. Engineers test current with lines looped around their waists. Their reports spare to the point of poetry anchors hold. Left bank silty, span stable to 3 tons. These phrases do not dazzle, but they move regiments when dawn accepts them. I have a note from a German pioneer company detailing a spoiling fire mission that collapsed an attempted crossing in mid-berth, the kind of unphotographable decision that edits a map for weeks. If there is an intimacy that deserves the name hand-to-hand, it is here: fingers on rope, hands under beam, the blunt touch that makes ideas stand on water. Signals falter and are resurrected. A sergeant sits before a stuttering set and feeds it new fuses like communion wafers. Elsewhere, a flag panel, derided in theory, retires a rumor by midday because it speaks in color when static steals verbs. I have the transcript of a German net where a calm voice domesticated panic with declarative sentences, unit designations, grid squares, times that move forward like stepping stones. In a Soviet report, a liaison officer is credited with nothing fancier than present, and I underline that word until the paper nearly tears. Presence has a military utility entirely separate from charisma. It keeps minutes from unraveling. Salvage patrols cross the ground between lines with a cunning older than doctrine. They move low and slow, lured by the glitter of optics not yet claimed, deterred by the mean traps of a disappointed day, mines kicked from lanes by blast, wires that look like roots and behave like lies. The inventories they bring back read like folktales told by accountants, periscope usable, sight fogged, track pin serviceable, radio silence, possibly mortal. Their trophies do not swell myths, but they lengthen tomorrow's reach. In the accounts I trust most, the battle's outcome is not a crescendo, but the slow stacking of these small, stubborn wins. Somewhere along the embankment, a raid pushes too far and returns bloodied but lucid. The participants later describe closeness in human dimensions, voices audible, metal warm to the palm. They speak of grenades and of a hatch slammed just in time. I do not deny them. I place their moment like a hot coal on the larger grate of the night, where the draft is governed by observation posts, trip flares, and the old, stern etiquette of positions learned by touch. The great armored formations do not grapple in the dark. They breathe and are reset by those who serve them. The grappling belongs to the margins, and even there it is the punctuation of night, not the grammar. Commanders tour their perimeters like skeptical shepherds. Rotmistrov's staff notes are brief, almost penitential units aligned on recognizable features, ammunition redistributed, an insistence that tomorrow's impetus must come from organization rather than from faith. In the Sekunden SS Panzer Corps War Diary, the tone is equally unromantic, observation retained, counterattack postponed, strength counted in barrels and crews rather than in adjectives. I have learned to read these tones as a kind of moral courage. To refuse the seduction of a nighttime lunge after such a day is to pay a kind of respect to both friend and foe, the respect of not throwing tired men into a grinder for the sake of a line in a communique. Death receives its portion. Burial details move with the authority of necessity. Dog tags clink into tins. Names migrate from lips to lists. A soldier straightens a cross improvised from track links. Another finds a photograph and tucks it beneath a folded tarp because there is nowhere else to place it that feels like shelter. These gestures seldom enter official histories. They are the hand-to-hand the living cannot escape the manual labor of ending a day without surrendering to it. When I close a file on losses and reopen one labeled replacements, I feel the chill of bureaucracy at its most humane and most unforgiving. As midnight approaches, the field graduates from trauma to tension. The embankment returns to its old utility, a line where silhouette and shadow bargain. Artillery becomes harassing fire, a metronome that keeps sleep from hardening into complacency. In a Soviet log, a single sentence holds enemy artillery active, our camouflage effective. In a German one, Soviet tank movement heard, no assault. Both lines are truer than any panoramic claim. The big story, if it is to be honest, is a tapestry woven from cautions. Every thread is a unit refusing hysteria in favor of procedure. I sit with the claim that will not die, that tanks fought like wrestlers under the sky. I understand why men reached for that picture. Shock records itself at the scale of a heartbeat in an arm's length. It is not an error, it is a human unit of measurement. But I also hold the pages that count angles. Note hull-down positions, diagram arcs like a schoolmaster rendering a theorem. The pages do not sneer, they illuminate. The night, by granting everyone time to breathe, lets those two truths stand without cannibalizing each other. Closeness existed in pockets, in incidents. in rescues and in last acts. Predominance belonged to systems. Toward the small hours, orders for dawn are drafted with pencils that have seen too much erasing. They are not grand. Shift a battalion to the left to dress the line. Resight 2 guns to rake a gap. Hold smoke for the first 20 minutes. Send patrols along the river to determine honesty from rumor. The art of continuation is the most neglected of arts. It wins more battles than any heroism can. When I finish reading, I close the folder with a careful hand. The day behind it was loud. The night that followed was exact. And out of that exactness, morning will have enough structure to try again. Not as myth demands, but as history allows. Dawn returned with the civility of a clerk, laying its pale stamp on everything that had survived the night. Dew glossed the black skin of wrecks, and for a few indecent minutes the steppe looked tender again, as if the earth had not learned any new cruelties in the last 24 hours. I measured the morning by the sound of engines persuaded back into belief cough. Catch. Idle, and by the low voices around the embankment where sergeants redressed lines the way tailors pull seams true. Reports traveled first on boot leather, then by wire. The verbs had changed. Seize and break yielded to reconstitute, hold, and probe. That vocabulary, unglamorous and faithful, is how history sounds when the smoke has nowhere left to hide. I opened a folder of aerial prints flown at first light. The steppe. Seen from that quiet height, confessed secrets none of the witnesses could carry unaided. You can pick out the fan patterns where German guns had worked methodically, the smudged lanes where Soviet sappers cut arteries under fire, the dark scallops along the rail embankment where approach routes curled up and died. A line of hulks near a culvert drew the eye. Each wreck an argument the ground had won. When I laid the photographs beside the night's logs, cause and effect stitched themselves with a stubborn thread, a 5-minute smoke mission here. A row of saved silhouettes there, a battery silenced at dusk, a new corridor discovered by patrols at midnight. The rumor of wrestling does not leave fingerprints on film, geometry does, and it is a stern teacher. Rotmistrov's staff, notes for the morning, were cool to the touch. Tank Corps were to dress on recognizable features, restore ammunition, and prepare for offensive action upon ascertainment of enemy weakness. Replacement vehicles trickled in, some fresh from railheads, others resurrected from the previous day's dead. The ledger I keep by habit showed mathematics no legend can improve companies consolidated, battalions reduced to mixed platoons, commanders reassigned to machines not of their original make. The myth of hand-to-hand has no room for this paperwork. The battle itself is built out of it, across the embankment. Toten SS Panzer Corps recorded something like modesty in German Totenkopf, guarding the cell crossings. Leibstandarte holding the rail line's brow. Das Reich feeding in where counter-thrusts looked less expensive than withdrawals. Ammunition states were the loudest sentences. Barrel wear had voices of its own. The river, which the day before had looked like a ribbon only a poet would mention, matured into a fact that planners could not ignore. I read the pioneer diaries with a respect that borders on affection. Anchors tested, pontoon sections counted, current judged by eye and by a string, let slip from a hand that could no longer pretend to be steady. A Soviet attempt at a stronger crossing faltered under enfilade the Germans wrote down as a mere routine mission. There is an obscenity in the neutral tone of such entries. And yet that neutrality is the quality that keeps armies from lying to themselves. The cell could be talked across by rhetoric. It had to be walked across by engineers. On this morning, it refused. What the living could do, they did. Salvage parties moved early, greedy for minutes before the sun reheated the air into hostility. A Panther gave up an optic sound enough to guide decisions for a week. A T-34 surrendered a pump that would make another crew believe. Rec reading became curriculum. A turret cut at the ring warned against cresting too high on the embankment's face. A charred hull at a lane's mouth condemned hesitation more than audacity. A Soviet corporal showed me a photograph of such a hull years later and tapped its edge the way a patient taps a scar when trying to describe the weather. We learned quickly, he said, and the softness of his voice was not pity but precision. Casualty returns thickened. Numbers are a narcotic, and yet one must take them. I cross-checked tallies the way a miser counts coins twice, then once more. The early Soviet claims of large German losses printed in newspapers while the smoke still hung find their corrections in duller ledgers. German reports, proud of economy, undercount their own broken teeth until inspection forces sincerity. Between those shores, later historians threw their bridges, some sturdy, some theatrical. I consult both sides and then rest my hand on the aerial prints again. Dozens of German machines damaged or destroyed. Yes, but nothing like the avalanche the pamphlets promised. Ruin among the Soviet Corps as well, often concentrated where lanes pinched or where the rail line demanded a poor angle for a desperate peak. The rumor cannot survive a ruler. It does not evaporate, it translates itself into a simpler story, but the ruler remains. I walked the embankment with a veteran who had commanded a gun there. He put his boot heel into the earth and scuffed until a shard of casing gleamed. Here we waited, he said, and patience was the only bravery no one photographed. He did not deny the moments of closeness. He remembered a tank so near he could see the loader's elbow. He remembered a ram, a terrible, clumsy kiss of steel that every memoir seems to want to carry on its back like a trophy. But he lifted his eyes and swept his palm across the fields. Mostly, he said, we killed at the distances we trained for, and we died at them too. I wrote that sentence word for word and underlined the mostly because that is where mature history lives. Propaganda had already gone to work. Crews with cameras arrived late and prowled along the accessible wrecks, framing their narratives. A hatch torn wide suggests intimacy. A heap of spent shell cases promises frenzy. A burned meadow flatters the idea that the day burned in one tall flame rather than in many stubborn, overlapping fires. I found a newsreel script in an archive, breathless in its insistence that steel wrestled steel all along the line. The film it accompanied showed smoke, wrecks, faces, and the gorgeous lie that pictures prefer that what is within lens distance must be typical. I do not call the script a falsehood. I call it the child of a battlefield too large to fit in a frame and a public that deserves consolation. The command decisions that morning declined consolation and chose posture. Rotmistrov retained enough cohesion to threaten again if the enemy blinked. Hauser held enough order to punish any blink that lacked conviction. Artillery, having spent its earlier eloquence, shifted to a clipped diction of interdiction roads, crossings, assembly areas. Smoke was budgeted like currency. Air power, in reconnaissance more than attack, offered the kind of guidance no rumor understands photographs that argue with memoirs and do not care whom they offend. I traced on one such photo the faint tracks of an attempted oblique approach that doctrine would never bless an improvisation born of the night's reflection, and I noted how far it got before the fan patterns of defensive fire wrote no across the soil. What remained to decide was not the myth but the map. The line around Prokhorovka hardened into the shape that later operational histories reproduce with the calm of hindsight. The famous day had culminated. In the great debate shock against depth, neither side found a clean moral. Shock did not carve the rail line into a boulevard. Depth did not erase the courage that hurled mass against its teeth. If there is a verdict worth keeping, it lies in the way both commands treated the morning as a ledger, not as a poem. I say this as someone who has read the poems and felt their old heat. The ledger preserved more lives than any sonnet could. I was asked in a lecture hall years later what I would tell a student who loves the image of two tanks ramming under a July sun. I answered with a loader's hands, scarred and proud, with a sapper's rod probing earth by feel, with a gun line that waited under discipline strong enough to be called tenderness, with a commander who refused a last, wasteful lunge and therefore bought the afternoon. I answered with the smell of cordite that never quite leaves a memory, and with the quiet arithmetic of those aerial photographs. Was it hand to hand, the student persisted. Sometimes, I said, and those times are real, but mostly it was men doing careful work under punishment. If we love them, we must love that work. By mid-morning, burial details folded the field back into itself. Names left mouths and entered ledgers. I watched a soldier straighten a cross made of track links and understood that this, too, Is hand-to-hand the touch by which the living admit the dead. Far off, a train called somewhere else to war. Nearer, engines idled with the patience of animals that have learned their owner's limits. The embankment kept its counsel. Wheat rattled dryly over fragments that will outlast every narrative. The day's official communiques were brighter than the field warranted and dimmer than propaganda would have liked. I collected them anyway. They belong in the file because memory is a coalition, not a monarchy. As the sun climbed, commanders, convinced that the time for decisive gestures had passed, put their faith in that most modest of strategies to continue. The rumor did what rumors do. It survived without needing to be true in all senses. My record does what records do. It keeps receipts for the living and the dead. By midday, the second day had learned restraint as an art form. The rail line held its breath. The Pacelle ran with the good manners of water, and along the embankment, decisions shrank to their most consequential size meters. Minutes, the number of smoke pots left in a crate. I watched commanders trade in that currency, and the battle's legend, so fond of grand gestures, slipped to the edges where it belongs. Rotmistrov conserved enough mass to threaten, and Hauser conserved enough fire to deny. Reports that afternoon were sober local pushes bloodied, observation posts retained, artillery husbanded, crossings denied. The map, nearing the shape the historians would later trace with calm fingers. No longer jerked in spasms, it settled, reluctant and final. Into the truth recorded in both languages, the thrust had culminated. What came next belonged to the wider campaign. North of us, the Soviet counter-offensive began to pry at Orel. South, the preparations that would be named after a great general gathered in the heat. I have the serial orders that reflect this widening. They read like a door opening in a long corridor. Tank armies were angled for future blows rather than fed to a now stubborn line. German formations wrote of withdrawing fingers to save the hand. These are not sentences the myth enjoys. These are the sentences that write victory and defeat in prose. The rams and close shouts echoed, but it was the logistics of a failing intention that set the date stamp on the battle. Citadel would not find air to breathe again. I returned, in my reading and later on foot, to the places where rumor insists on intimacy. The culvert that fed wrecks, the shallow tongue of ground where a commander had tried audacity like an old key in a new lock, the Bolka that swallowed a company whole. Veterans took me to those angles and relived them, not with triumph, but with a craftsman's critique. Here we climbed too high. One said, boot scraping clay. Here we waited a second too long because dust lied. In these sentences, the hand that myth demands became the hand I trust, the hand that turned a sight drum, tamped a charge, found a gear by touch when the lever shook like a frightened bone. If closeness means the feel of another man's breath, it lived in rescues and in last acts and in four-handed labors under a hull too hot to touch. If closeness means the tactical fact that governed outcomes, it belonged to lines and arcs, to ranges and patience. I carry both definitions and refuse to let one starve the other. The casualty ledgers make no concessions to poetry. They are an argument conducted in ink and pain. Soviet returns corrected their first victorious estimates with the grim arithmetic of inspection. German returns, proud of economy of force, surrendered their mistakes when photographs and inventories made denial a luxury. I lay those ledgers beside the aerial prints and find the discipline that decides historiography more than memoirs do. German armor losses were real, but not catastrophic in the way posters promised. Soviet losses were heavy where lanes pinched and where the embankment enforced unkind geometry. The exchange, uncomfortable for both sides, supported the larger truth already forming the offensive, had spent itself against prepared depth. The counterpunch would not be a single blow, but a campaign that walked forward on bridges made from repair schedules and rail timetables. When I lecture on this field, someone always asks for numbers. I give them with the hesitations they deserve, because the archive does not sing in one pitch. Then I take them back to the loaders. I tell them about a Soviet man who fed a gun until his arms bled varnish and the sweat tasted of cordite, and about a German man who mirrored him with different brass, the two of them never to meet except in a geometry that neither could see. I talk about sappers who clipped lanes through night and into noon, whose work channeled courage into narrow threads and made it look, from far away, like flood. I talk about mechanics who pulled pumps from dead hulls and slid them into survivors, and about sergeants who brought radios back from capricious silence. These are not numerators and denominators. These are the reasons any number becomes possible. As afternoon sloped into evening again, the embankment returned to being a wall that denies perspective to those who do not honor it. Patrols felt forward without promises. Artillery punished crossroads as though punctuation were a moral act. Field kitchens, those humble chapels of continuation, fed the living enough to keep the night from seizing the will. I read the day's final orders shift here, refuse there, prepare for relief, and heard in them the intelligence of restraint. That intelligence is easy to overlook when cameras crave climax. It saved more lives than heroism could, and it wrote the rest of the summer with a steadier hand than any museum placard allows. And then there are the dead. My notebooks have margins where names go when patience is a duty. In a ditch near the rail, a burial detail found 4 men whose uniforms made them enemies and whose faces made them kin. A soldier crossed 2 track links and set them upright. Another carved a name into an ammunition crate lid because letters demand wood when paper cannot be spared. These acts belong to no communique and to every conclusion. If I must answer the question that made Prokhorovka famous, I must answer it in front of that makeshift cross. The day was fierce enough to convince men that distance vanished. It was structured enough to be explained without betraying them. Later, in cities far from wheat and iron, newsreels spliced wrecks and smoke into a simpler story. A narrator's warm baritone praised ramming and spoke of wrestling machines as if the field had been a circus. Those films are a kind of kindness you cannot ask mothers and children to parse miles and defilade before supper. Still, I keep a private anger for the way they diminish the workers of violence, those who wore discipline like a second set of bones. The closeness they celebrated existed and deserves its frame. The predominance they claimed did not. To say so is not to insult the courage of those who closed within shouting distance. It is to elevate the courage of those who held to procedures under a sun that made thinking feel like sin. When I finally walked away from the embankment, the wheat was high again, and the cell kept its plausible innocence. The rail, rusty and quiet, had the courtesy not to echo. I put my palm on its flange and felt nothing but warmth the sun had loaned it. Nearby, a boy on a bicycle skidded to look at the plaques fixed by later hands. He asked what happened here. I said that tanks fought and men fought, and that some of them fought very near, and some of them never saw the faces of those they killed. I said that the closeness that matters most is sometimes not of bodies, but of plans, how one army's habits entered another's and undid them. He nodded in that polite way children nod when adults tidy reality. I did not burden him with more, but later, at my desk, I opened the folder of aerials again and laid it beside a memoir scrawled in a slanted hand. Between them, the day lives not as rumor desires, but as the dead deserve. If this sounds like a refusal to yield romance, it is not. It is an invitation to a more durable love, to admire the way human beings contain panic with routines, how ordinary bravery measured in seconds saved by a loader or meters gained by a sapper's lane outlasts banners. The hand-to-hand at Prokhorovka, as rumor understands it, happened in bursts and at edges. And those bursts were terrible and real. The battle that decided the day what guns reached, what fields were denied, what lanes were cut, what rivers refused, happened under the governance of system. To hold both is to be just. Even now, when July light warms the page, and I can smell phantom cordite in a room that has never seen it, the field insists on its original plea: do not let the heat steal the structure, and do not let the structure sterilize the heat. I keep that promise by returning, in words and on foot, to the embankment, the balka, the culvert, the water, the faces. I keep it by allowing the old metaphor to stand where it belongs, as a true description of how terror taught distance to lie, and by telling the larger truth as the archive demands. This is the respect the living can give and the dead can accept.